parting seas, resurrecting the dead, divine acts that defy every law of nature, or are they the greatest deception ever told? For centuries, biblical miracles have been the pillar of faith for millions of people around the world. But what if I told you that a 17th century philosopher named Baruch Spinoza wielded a razor of ruthless logic against these very narratives? His arguments, forgotten by many and ignored by others, could shake the foundations of everything you thought you knew about miracles, faith, and even God himself. Get ready, because we are going to question everything you have been taught. Are you ready for philosophy to challenge faith? Are you prepared to see biblical miracles through a completely different lens? Welcome to this journey that promises to be, at the very least, absolutely revealing. This is not about attacking anyone's beliefs. This is about daring to think, to question, to examine what we have accepted without scrutiny for so long. Let us begin. Today we are not going to talk about blind faith or literal interpretations without critical thought. Today we are inviting to our table a thinker who dared to challenge the conventions of his time and whose ideas continue to resonate with brutal force even now, centuries later. Baruch Spinoza. This 17th century Dutch Jewish philosopher was no ordinary man. He was excommunicated from his own community, branded a heretic, cast out and cursed, precisely for thinking differently, for applying reason where others only saw dogma that could not be questioned. And one of his primary targets, one of his pet peeves, was precisely biblical miracles. For Spinoza, the idea of a God who capriciously intervenes in the world, breaking his own laws whenever he feels like it, was not only illogical, but an actual insult to divine perfection itself. Think about that for a moment. An insult to God by believing in miracles. Hold on tight, because we are going to unravel his logic step by step, piece by piece, and you will see how, according to him, biblical miracles not only fail to prove the existence of God, but actually contradict the very nature of what God is supposed to be. Intrigued, confused, maybe even a little offended? Well, this has only just begun. Let us dive deep into why Spinoza believed that miracles are essentially a fraud against reason itself. To understand the bombshell Spinoza dropped on the religious establishment of his time, we have to get inside his head, into his revolutionary concept of God. Forget the bearded old man sitting on a cloud somewhere in the sky, pulling the strings of the universe at his whim like some cosmic puppet master. For Spinoza, God is nature. Yes, you heard that right. Deus sive natura, he wrote in Latin. God or nature, they are one and the same thing. This is not simple pantheism where you worship trees and rivers. This is a profound, radical vision of reality itself. The infinite divine substance, with all its attributes, is manifested in the immutable and eternal order of the cosmos. Everything that exists within God, and God exists within everything. The laws of nature, from gravity that keeps your feet on the ground to the way a tiny seed grows into a massive tree, are not divine whims or random choices. They are the very expression of God's essence, of God's being. They are eternal, they are immutable, they are perfect. If God is perfect and eternal, unchanging and complete, then so are his rules of the game, the natural laws that govern reality. They cannot change. They cannot be suspended. They cannot be broken, not even by God himself. Do you begin to see where the torpedo is heading? Straight to the waterline of miracles. Think about it carefully. If God is nature itself and its laws, how could he violate them without violating himself, without contradicting his own perfection and constancy? It would be like God fighting against God. This is the absolute cornerstone of Spinoza's entire argument against miracles. So what is a miracle according to the traditional religious view? An event that surpasses normal experience, that violates the laws of nature, something that only direct divine intervention could possibly explain. Water turning into wine, the sun standing still in the sky, a man rising from the dead after 3 days. But this is precisely where Spinoza says, wait a minute, stop right there. If God is nature and his laws are the direct manifestation of his perfect and immutable being, then a miracle, as commonly understood by religious people, is a logical impossibility. It cannot happen. It would be like saying that God suddenly decides that 2 + 2 is no longer 4 but 5, just for a little while, just to impress some people. For Spinoza, this would imply that God is capricious, that he changes his mind, that he is fickle, unreliable, or even worse, it would mean that his original laws were not so perfect after all, if they needed to be corrected or suspended from time to time. A God who performs miracles in this traditional sense would be an imperfect God, a God who contradicts himself, a God who made mistakes in setting up the universe and now has to step in to fix things. And that was absolutely inconceivable for a rationalist like Spinoza. Therefore, miracle accounts cannot be interpreted as events that literally broke the natural order, because that would break the very nature of God himself. Is your head exploding yet? Well, wait until you see how this iron logic applies to specific biblical examples that millions hold sacred. Let us take a classic example, one of the most iconic miracles in the entire Bible, the parting of the Red Sea. The book of Exodus tells us that Moses, by divine order, extended his staff over the waters, and the sea literally parted, the waters standing up like walls on both sides, so that the Israelites could walk across on dry ground and escape from the pursuing Egyptian army. It is an awesome, breathtaking image, one of the most powerful moments in all of religious history. But Spinoza would tell us, wait a minute, let us analyze this with the cold, hard logic of nature itself. If God is nature and her laws are constant, unchanging and perfect, how could this possibly happen? Now here is where Spinoza gets interesting. He does not deny that something extraordinary, something unusual could have occurred at that location at that time, but he would look for an explanation within the laws of nature, no matter how rare or infrequent that natural phenomenon might be. Perhaps there was an extremely low tide combined with a strong, steady wind blowing in just the right direction for hours. Perhaps it was a seiche, which is a standing wave or oscillation of water in a closed or semi-closed basin, like a lake or a narrow sea. Perhaps there was some other uncommon, but not impossible, natural event that created temporary passage through shallow waters. What Spinoza flatly rejects, what he considers absolutely impossible, is the idea that God intervened supernaturally to break the fundamental laws of water and gravity. For him, if something like this happened, and he does not necessarily deny that the Israelites crossed at that point, it must have a natural explanation, even if the witnesses of the time, due to their complete ignorance of science and natural phenomena, attributed it to direct divine intervention. They did not understand meteorology, they did not understand tides, they did not understand physics. So when they saw something unusual, something they could not explain, they naturally attributed it to God breaking the rules. The key issue here is in the interpretation of the event, not necessarily in denying that an event occurred. Ancient people interpreted extraordinary natural events as miracles because they lacked the scientific framework to understand them. And this is crucial to understanding Spinoza's position. He is not calling Moses a liar. He is saying that the interpretation of what happened is wrong. Now let us move to the New Testament and examine another fundamental miracle for the Christian faith, Jesus walking on water. Imagine the scene as described in the Gospels. The disciples are in their boat in the middle of the night, terrified by a violent storm with waves crashing over the sides. And suddenly they see a figure approaching them, walking calmly on the turbulent Sea of Galilee as if it was solid ground. For believers, this is irrefutable proof of his divinity, of his power over nature itself. But what would Spinoza say? Exactly the same thing he said about the Red Sea. The law of gravity and the density of water are natural laws, direct expressions of God's nature and being. A human being with their mass and density cannot walk on liquid water without sinking. This is not a rule God made up randomly. This is how reality works. This is what water is. This is what gravity does. So how should we interpret this story according to Spinoza's framework? Spinoza would suggest that either the story is symbolic, a powerful metaphor for faith overcoming the difficulties and storms of life, or that there was a misinterpretation of a natural event that actually occurred. Perhaps Jesus was walking on a submerged sandbar near the shore that the disciples in the dark and the storm could not see. Perhaps he was on a piece of floating debris or a partially submerged rock formation. Perhaps, in some retellings over the decades before the Gospels were written down, a less miraculous event became embellished into something more dramatic. The point is that the supernatural explanation, the idea that the physical laws governing water and human bodies were violated, is for Spinoza logically untenable, completely impossible. If God is perfect, and his laws are immutable expressions of his perfect nature, then those laws cannot be broken. Not by anyone, not for any reason, not even to prove a religious point. So if miracles are not violations of natural laws, what are they, according to Spinoza? Are they all lies, deliberate inventions created by ancient priests to control people? Here is where Spinoza becomes more subtle and more interesting. He does not necessarily accuse the biblical authors of being conscious fraudsters, of deliberately making up stories they knew were false. Rather, he suggests that miracles are narratives that must be understood in their proper historical and cultural context. They were ways of expressing profound ideas, moral and spiritual teachings, using language and imagery that were striking and memorable to the people of that time and place. Think about it seriously for a moment. In a world without modern science, without any understanding of physics, chemistry, biology, or meteorology, any unusual or difficult to explain event was easily attributed to supernatural causes, to the intervention of gods or demons or spirits. This was not stupidity. This was simply the framework people had for understanding their world. When something amazing happened that they could not explain, what other explanation did they have available? Miracle accounts, then, would be stories laden with deep meaning, carefully designed to inspire faith, to encourage obedience to moral laws, or to highlight the importance of a prophetic figure like Moses or Jesus. They were not scientific reports trying to document physical facts. They were powerful parables, teaching stories, narratives constructed to convey spiritual and ethical truths in a way that would stick in people's minds and hearts. The fraud, according to Spinoza's logic, lay not so much in the original intention of the narrators thousands of years ago, but in the subsequent literal and uncritical interpretation that takes these stories as facts that defy reason and nature. This is where the word fraud in our title comes in, and it is critically important to qualify it properly in light of what Spinoza actually argued. If we understand fraud as a distortion of reality with the intention to deceive, Spinoza would say that the real fraud, the actual deception happening, is to present these ancient accounts as literal evidence of a God acting against his own laws, against his own nature. For him, the Bible is not a science book. It is not a history book in the modern sense, where we expect footnotes and verified sources. Its primary purpose, its whole reason for existing, is to teach obedience to God through justice and charity, through ethical living and compassion for others. The stories of miracles in this context would serve to impress the masses, to make the moral teachings more vivid and memorable and emotionally powerful. It is not that the original authors wanted to lie about physics or biology or how water behaves. They were using the language, the concepts and the beliefs of their time to communicate something they considered far more important than scientific accuracy. The problem arises when centuries later, when we have microscopes and telescopes and particle accelerators, we still insist that these accounts must be accepted as literal descriptions of events that broke the natural order. That is where, according to Spinoza's iron logic, a distortion occurs, a kind of intellectual fraud by asking modern people to believe in something that contradicts God's own perfect and unchanging nature. Spinoza argued passionately that belief in miracles, understood as breaks in the natural order, actually weakens the true understanding of God. If God can change the rules whenever he wants, how can we trust that there is a universal order at all? How can we study nature and expect to find consistency, patterns, laws that hold true? We cannot do science in a universe where the rules change randomly. For Spinoza, the true wonder, the true miracle, if you will, is the perfect and constant order of nature itself. Every sunrise that happens exactly when the mathematics predict. Every seed that germinates following the same biological processes. Every physical law that is fulfilled without exception, billions and trillions of times across the universe. That is God in action. That is the real divine presence, not in random violations of order, but in the order itself. To believe that God needs magic tricks to demonstrate his power, that he needs to break his own rules to impress people, actually undervalues the magnificence of his constant and orderly creation. It makes God smaller, not larger. It makes him seem insecure, like he needs to show off. Therefore, instead of looking for God in the exceptional, in what breaks the rules and defies explanation, Spinoza invites us to find him in the universal, in the eternal laws that govern all that exists, without exception. This is a brutal paradigm shift, a complete reversal of how most people think about God and the divine, from an interventionist and personal God, who answers prayers and performs miracles, to a God who is the system itself, perfect and unalterable, expressed in every natural law and every mathematical truth. A vision that undoubtedly can be deeply uncomfortable for many people who want a God who listens and intervenes. Spinoza's logic, therefore, does not seek to destroy faith, but to purify it from what he considers superstition and ignorance. For him, true piety, real devotion to God, does not consist in blindly believing in stories that defy reason and contradict logic. True piety consists in understanding and loving the necessary order of nature, which is God himself expressing his eternal and perfect being. If biblical miracles are interpreted as metaphors, as moral teachings wrapped in shocking and memorable narratives, then there is no conflict whatsoever with reason. The conflict only arises when literal belief is demanded in the violation of natural laws, when people insist that the stories must be physically, historically true, exactly as written. And this is where his argument becomes so persuasive and powerful for many people. He is not asking you to stop believing in a profound spiritual message or in ethical teachings. He is not asking you to abandon morality or compassion or justice. He is asking you to stop believing in what he considers a logical impossibility, something that also belittles and diminishes the idea of a perfect God. It is an invitation to a more mature faith, a more rational faith, where the wonder is not in the exception to the rule, but in the immutable rule itself, in the beauty and perfection of the universe as it actually operates. Does this mean that the biblical accounts lose their value entirely? For Spinoza, absolutely not. They simply gain a different kind of value, no longer as historical and scientific documents, but as repositories of ethical and moral wisdom, as powerful stories that teach us how to live justly and love our neighbors. So, are biblical miracles the greatest fraud in history? According to Baruch Spinoza's implacable logic, if we understand them as literal violations of the laws of a nature that is God himself, then yes, they would indeed be a contradiction, an impossibility that distances us from a rational understanding of the divine. They would be a fraud in the sense that they ask us to believe something that contradicts the very nature of what God is. But if we view them as powerful narratives laden with symbolism and moral teachings, stories adapted to the mentality of their time and place, then they can retain profound value without necessarily clashing with reason or logic. Spinoza's proposal is challenging, there is no doubt about that. It forces you to rethink not only miracles themselves, but also your own conception of God, faith, reason, and what it means to be religious. It asks uncomfortable questions that many people would prefer not to face. But that is exactly what philosophy does. It disturbs our comfortable assumptions. I am not asking you to blindly accept what Spinoza said. That would be ironic, considering his whole argument is against blind acceptance. Instead, I am asking you to dare to think, to question, to apply your own logic and reasoning to these ancient stories. What do you think? Are you convinced by Spinoza's argument that miracles as literal events are logically impossible? Or do you think there is room for miracles, as they are traditionally understood, even in a rational universe? Additionally, let me know your opinion in the comments below. This debate is far too fascinating to leave here. Does Spinoza's logic hold up? Or are there flaws in his reasoning? Can faith and reason coexist when it comes to miracles? And if this journey through philosophy and faith has blown your mind, given you something new to think about, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video, because there is much more to question, much more to explore, and many more sacred cows to examine with the tools of logic and reason.